I was standing in the emergency room with my right arm shattered in 3 places, barely able to sign the admission forms with my left hand, when my mother-in-law leaned close to my ear and whispered the words that would change everything. "My son taught you a lesson." She said it with satisfaction, like a teacher praising a student who'd finally learned to behave. I looked up at her through tears of pain and shock, and in that moment I understood that the woman who'd welcomed me into her family 5 years earlier had never seen me as a daughter. She'd seen me as property that needed to be kept in line. But what Diane Harper didn't know, what neither she nor my husband Brandon could have predicted, was that this time I'd had enough. This time I wasn't going to accept their excuses or explanations. This time I was going to fight back, and when I did, would expose not just one abuser but an entire family system built on control, violence, and the kind of respectability that hides monsters in plain sight. The broken arm was just the beginning. What came after, the evidence I gathered, the allies who emerged, the courtroom showdown that destroyed their carefully constructed image, that's the story that needs to be told. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just give me justice. It shattered a family's facade, exposed decades of enabling and abuse, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone thinks are perfect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Harper, though by the time this story ends that last name would mean something very different to me than it did on my wedding day. I'm 32 years old, and for the past year I've been running the Riverside Women's Advocacy Center, a nonprofit I founded to help domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. People who meet me now see someone confident and purposeful, someone who speaks at community events and testifies before city council about the need for better protective services. What they don't immediately see is the woman I was just 18 months ago, the one who made excuses for bruises, who believed that love meant enduring pain, who thought that keeping a marriage together was more important than keeping herself safe. That woman believed her husband when he said he was sorry. She believed her mother-in-law when she said that strong marriages required forgiveness and patience. She believed that the broken bones and emergency room visits were somehow her fault, evidence of her own clumsiness or her failure to be the wife Brandon needed her to be. I met Brandon Harper in the spring of 2017 at Grace Community Fellowship, the church I'd been attending for about 6 months after moving to Riverside for a job opportunity. I was 26, working as a dental hygienist at a practice downtown, living in a small apartment, and trying to build a life in a city where I didn't know many people. The church had a young professionals group that met every Thursday evening, and Brandon was one of the core members, always arriving early to set up chairs and staying late to help clean up. He was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that made mothers smile approvingly. Tall, with dark hair that he kept neatly trimmed, blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a confidence that came from growing up in a family where success was expected and usually achieved. He worked in commercial real estate, and even then he had a way of talking about his career that made it sound both important and noble, like he wasn't just selling properties but building communities and creating opportunities. Our first conversation happened over terrible church coffee and store-bought cookies. He asked me about my background, seemed genuinely interested in my work, and made me laugh with a story about a disastrous property showing where the previous tenant had left behind 3 cats and a python. He was charming without being overwhelming, attentive without being pushy. When he asked for my phone number at the end of the evening, I gave it to him without hesitation. We went on our first date 3 days later, dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant called Giuseppe's where the lighting was warm and the servers knew him by name. He ordered wine without looking at the price, asked thoughtful questions about my family and my dreams, and paid the check before I could even offer to split it. When he walked me to my car, he kissed me gently on the cheek and told me he'd had a wonderful time. I floated home feeling like I'd finally met someone who had his life together, someone stable and kind and ready for something serious. The courtship followed a pattern I would later recognize as calculated but at the time felt like romance. Brandon called when he said he would. He planned dates that showed thought and effort, taking me to a botanical garden because I'd mentioned loving flowers, bringing me coffee at work because he knew I had early morning appointments. He introduced me to his family within the first month, and that was when I met Diane Harper for the first time. She lived in a large home in the nicest part of Riverside, a 2-story brick house with a manicured lawn and interior design that looked like something from a magazine. She welcomed me with a hug that felt slightly too long and too tight, the kind of embrace that establishes ownership rather than affection. She served an elaborate dinner: roasted chicken with herbs she'd grown in her own garden, roasted vegetables, homemade rolls that were still warm. Throughout the meal she talked about family, about the importance of building a strong foundation, about how her late husband, a respected judge who'd passed away 2 years earlier, had always said that character was more important than anything else. Brandon's siblings were there that night too. His older sister, Catherine, was a corporate attorney who worked in Portland and drove down for family dinners every Sunday. His younger brother, Thomas, was finishing his medical residency in family medicine. The conversation around that dinner table was sophisticated and fast-paced, touching on politics and current events, filled with the kind of casual references to professional accomplishments that made it clear this was a family where success wasn't just encouraged but required. I felt slightly out of my depth, aware that my community college degree and my job cleaning teeth probably didn't measure up to their Ivy League educations and prestigious careers. But Brandon held my hand under the table and squeezed it reassuringly. Later, as he drove me home, he told me his mother had called him into the kitchen and said she approved, that I seemed sweet and grounded and exactly what he needed. We were engaged 6 months later. Brandon proposed at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date, getting down on one knee beside our table while the other diners applauded. The ring was beautiful, a princess-cut diamond that must have cost more than I made in 2 months. I said yes through happy tears, and he slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that were steady and sure. The wedding was planned for the following June, and Diane took over most of the arrangements with an efficiency that left me feeling grateful and slightly overwhelmed. She knew the best florist, had connections with the country club for the reception, and seemed to have opinions about everything from the color of the bridesmaids' dresses to the font on the invitations. When I suggested small changes or expressed preferences that differed from hers, she would smile and say something like, "Trust me, dear, I've done this before," or, "We want this to reflect well on the family." I learned quickly that disagreeing with Diane Harper required more energy than I had, so I nodded and agreed and told myself that it didn't matter what flowers we had as long as I was marrying the man I loved. The wedding was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, perfectly coordinated and impressively executed but somehow lacking warmth. 200 guests filled the church, mostly Brandon's family friends and business associates. My side of the church was noticeably less populated. My mother had flown in from Arizona where she'd moved after remarrying, and my younger brother Caleb drove up from Eugene where he was working as a software engineer. A handful of co-workers attended, and a few friends from college made the trip, but the imbalance was obvious. During the reception, Diane gave a speech about how proud she was of Brandon, how he'd found a woman who would support him and build a life worthy of the Harper name. She barely mentioned me except as an extension of her son, a nice girl who would make a good wife. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself that joining a family meant accepting their ways of doing things. The first few months of marriage were happy, or at least they seemed happy on the surface. We moved into a house Brandon had found in Maplewood Estates, a suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and houses that all looked vaguely similar, 2-story colonials with attached garages and small yards. The house was larger than I needed and more expensive than I would have chosen, but Brandon insisted we needed space to grow into, room for the children we'd have someday. I decorated carefully, trying to balance my taste with what I thought would meet Diane's approval since she visited often, usually unannounced, always with opinions about where furniture should go or what colors would be more appropriate. Brandon worked long hours, often leaving before I woke up and coming home after I'd already eaten dinner. He said it was necessary, that he was building his career, that we needed to establish financial security. I understood, or I tried to. I picked up extra shifts at the dental practice and started taking online classes in medical billing, thinking that a more flexible career might be useful when we had children. The first incident happened in November of 2019, about 17 months after our wedding. We'd been invited to dinner at Diane's house, one of her elaborate Sunday meals that she insisted on having every week. I'd worked a long shift that Saturday and hadn't had time to go grocery shopping, so I'd stopped at the store on the way to her house and picked up a store-bought pie instead of baking something from scratch like she preferred. When I arrived and handed her the pie, still in its plastic container, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She thanked me with a voice that managed to convey both politeness and disappointment, then set the pie aside without putting it on the dessert table. During dinner, she mentioned to the table how she'd always taught her children that homemade food showed you cared about people, that taking shortcuts was a sign of not valuing relationships. Brandon's jaw tightened and he shot me a look across the table that I couldn't quite interpret but knew wasn't good. On the drive home, he was silent. I tried to make conversation, apologizing for the pie, explaining that I'd been tired, but he didn't respond. When we pulled into our garage and the door closed behind us, he finally spoke. His voice was cold and measured, more frightening than if he'd yelled. He told me I'd embarrassed him in front of his family. He said I'd made him look bad, made it seem like he'd married someone who didn't understand basic courtesy. I started to defend myself, to explain again, and that's when he grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to leave a bruise immediately, but with enough pressure that I gasped. He told me I needed to listen better, to pay attention to what was expected, to stop making excuses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then he released my wrist and walked into the house, leaving me sitting in the car, my wrist throbbing, my mind trying to process what had just happened. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself he'd been stressed at work. I told myself that maybe I had embarrassed him, that maybe I needed to try harder to fit into his family's expectations. The next day, my wrist was sore and slightly swollen. When I mentioned it at work, my coworker Janine asked if I was okay, and I laughed it off, said I'd slept on it wrong. The lie came easily, more easily than I would have expected. Brandon apologized that evening, bringing home flowers and my favorite takeout. He said he'd overreacted, that work had been stressful, that his mother's expectations sometimes got to him too. He held me and told me he loved me, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because acknowledging what had really happened would have meant admitting I'd made a terrible mistake in marrying him. The incidents became more frequent over the next 2 years, though the gaps between them were long enough that I could almost convince myself each one was isolated. In March of 2021, I supposedly fell down the stairs at home, an accident that left me with bruised ribs and difficulty breathing for weeks. I'd actually been pushed during an argument about my decision to quit the dental practice and take a job doing medical billing from home, a change Brandon said made me look lazy and unmotivated. The emergency room doctor had looked at me with concern, asking careful questions about whether I felt safe at home, but Brandon was right there in the room, holding my hand, looking worried and supportive. I told the doctor I was clumsy, that I'd tripped over the cat, and the doctor had nodded slowly, making notes in my chart that I couldn't see. Diane's role in all of this became clearer as time went on. Whenever I showed up to family dinners with a new injury, a sprained ankle or a bruised shoulder or a cut that required stitches, she would make sympathetic noises but also pointed comments. She'd say things like, "You really need to be more careful, Natalie," or "Brandon works so hard, the last thing he needs is to worry about you hurting yourself." Once, when I showed up with a black eye that I'd tried to cover with makeup, she'd pulled me aside in the kitchen and told me that strong wives knew how to avoid upsetting their husbands, that the key to a happy marriage was learning when to stay quiet. I'd stared at her, shocked, and she'd smiled and patted my shoulder like she'd just given me valuable advice. The breaking point came on October 15, 2023. Brandon had lost a major client that week, a deal he'd been working on for months that had fallen through at the last minute. He came home in a foul mood, pouring himself a drink before he'd even taken off his jacket. I was making dinner, trying to stay out of his way, moving quietly through the kitchen. He started talking about his day, about how the client had been unreasonable, about how his boss hadn't supported him properly. I made the mistake of suggesting that maybe it wasn't entirely the client's fault, that sometimes deals fell through for legitimate reasons. He turned on me with fury in his eyes, telling me I didn't understand business, that I had no right to comment on things I knew nothing about, that my opinion was worthless. I should have stayed silent. I should have apologized. But something in me that had been bending for 5 years finally broke. I told him he didn't get to talk to me that way. I told him I was his wife, not his verbal punching bag. I told him I was tired of walking on eggshells. He moved across the kitchen faster than I could react. His hand connected with the side of my face, a slap that made my ears ring and brought tears to my eyes instantly. I stumbled backward, trying to get away, and that's when he grabbed my right arm. I tried to pull free and he twisted, and I heard the snap before I felt the pain. It was a sound I'll never forget, like a branch breaking, followed by agony so intense I couldn't even scream at first. I just gasped, looking down at my arm hanging at an unnatural angle, and then the screaming started. Brandon stepped back, his face going pale. For a moment I thought he might help me, might call for an ambulance, might finally realize what he'd done. Instead, he told me to stop being dramatic. He said I'd pulled away too hard, that it was my fault for escalating things, that if I'd just stayed calm none of this would have happened. Then he called his mother. Diane arrived within 20 minutes. She took one look at my arm and her expression hardened, but not with concern for me. She looked angry, like I'd done something to inconvenience her. She and Brandon spoke in low voices in the hallway while I sat at the kitchen table, cradling my broken arm, trying not to vomit from the pain. When they came back, Diane told me we were going to the emergency room. She said I would tell them I'd fallen, that I'd tripped over something and tried to catch myself on the counter. She said it firmly, like she was giving instructions to a child, and Brandon stood behind her nodding. I looked between them, understanding in that moment just how deep this went, how complicit she'd been all along. But the pain was so intense I could barely think, so I just nodded. The drive to Riverside General Medical Center took 15 minutes. Diane drove while Brandon sat in the back seat with me, occasionally telling me to breathe, to stay calm, to remember what we were going to say. When we arrived at the emergency entrance, Diane helped me out of the car with a gentleness that might have looked caring to observers but felt like performance. We walked into the bright fluorescent lights of the ER waiting room, and a triage nurse immediately called us back when she saw my arm. That's when Diane leaned close and whispered those words that would echo in my mind for months afterward. "My son taught you a lesson." She said it quietly, so only I could hear, with a small smile that made my blood run cold. In that moment, standing in the emergency room with my arm shattered, I understood that I wasn't dealing with one abuser. I was dealing with two. And one of them had been hiding behind the mask of a concerned mother-in-law while enabling and encouraging her son's violence all along. But what Diane Harper didn't know as she sat in that emergency room waiting area, flipping through a magazine while I was taken back for x-rays, was that this time would be different. This time, the medical staff would see something that couldn't be explained away. This time, there would be evidence that even the Harper family's reputation couldn't erase. This time, I would find allies I didn't know I had, people who'd been watching and documenting and waiting for the moment when I was ready to fight back. The broken arm was just the beginning of their destruction. The X-ray technician was a woman in her late 40s named Carol Martinez who handled my arm with extraordinary gentleness, apologizing each time she needed to reposition it for imaging. The pain was excruciating despite the preliminary medication they'd given me, and I couldn't stop the tears that ran down my face. Carol kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, asking me about my work, about whether I had family nearby, about how the injury had happened. I repeated the story Diane had coached me to tell, that I'd tripped over a storage box in the garage, that I'd put my arm out to catch myself, that it was just a stupid accident. Carol nodded as she worked, her expression neutral, but something in her eyes made me think she didn't believe me. When she finished, she squeezed my uninjured hand and told me the doctor would review the images and be with me shortly. Dr. Vanessa Kim arrived in my examination room about 20 minutes later carrying a tablet with my x-rays displayed on the screen. She was a petite Korean-American woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver streaks in her black hair that she wore pulled back in a neat bun. She introduced herself as the attending physician in the emergency department that evening, then pulled up a stool and sat down so we were at eye level. She showed me the x-rays, pointing out the 3 distinct fracture points in my radius and ulna, explaining that this was what they called a complex fracture that would require surgical intervention to properly set. She spoke in a calm, professional tone, but her eyes never left my face. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Can you walk me through exactly how this happened?" I repeated my story about the storage box, about tripping, about putting my arm out. Dr. Kim listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, still watching my face with that intense, evaluating gaze. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Natalie, I've been an emergency physician for 19 years. I've seen thousands of fall injuries. The fracture pattern in your arm is not consistent with putting your hand out to catch yourself. The angle and location of the break suggest a twisting force, like someone grabbed your arm and torqued it while you were trying to pull away." I felt my face flush and my heart start pounding. I opened my mouth to protest, to insist that I'd just fallen, but no words came out. Dr. Kim leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I can't force you to tell me the truth. But I need you to know that I'm looking at your medical records right now, and this is your 4th emergency room visit in the past 3 years. November 2019, sprained wrist. March 2021, bruised ribs. June 2023, laceration requiring stitches. And now this. Each time, you've come in with your husband or his mother, and each time you've attributed the injury to your own clumsiness." She turned the tablet so I could see my medical history displayed on the screen, a damning timeline of injuries that I'd managed to think of as isolated incidents but which, when listed together, formed an undeniable pattern. Dr. Kim continued speaking, her voice still gentle but with an undertone of steel. "I'm required by law to report suspected domestic violence. I'm going to document what I see here, and I'm going to offer you resources. What you choose to do with those resources is your decision, but I need you to understand that this injury could have been much worse. If he twisted your arm hard enough to break it in 3 places, next time he might break your neck." The bluntness of her words hit me like cold water. I'd spent 5 years making excuses, minimizing, convincing myself it wasn't that bad. Hearing a medical professional say plainly that my husband could kill me made it impossible to hide behind those excuses any longer. I started crying in earnest then, not just from pain but from the release of finally having someone see the truth, someone who wasn't buying the lies I'd been telling myself and everyone else. Dr. Kim handed me tissues and waited patiently for me to compose myself enough to speak. When I finally did, my voice was shaky but the words came tumbling out. "My husband broke my arm. We were arguing and he grabbed me and twisted and it just snapped. His mother told me to lie about it. She's in the waiting room right now, and she told me as we walked in that her son taught me a lesson." Dr. Kim's jaw tightened and she made notes on her tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Then she asked if I felt safe going home, if there was somewhere else I could stay, if I had family or friends who could help me. I thought about my brother Caleb in Eugene, about my mother in Arizona, about the coworkers I'd lost touch with because Brandon had gradually isolated me from them. I told her I didn't know, that I needed time to think, that I was scared of what would happen if I accused Brandon publicly. Dr. Kim nodded, understanding in her eyes. She told me she was going to admit me overnight for observation and to schedule the surgery for the following morning. She said it was medically necessary given the complexity of the fracture, which was true, but I understood she was also giving me time away from Brandon and Diane, time in a safe place where I could think clearly. She asked if I wanted her to have security prevent my husband from visiting, and after a long moment I nodded yes. The relief I felt at that simple act of self-protection was overwhelming. Dr. Kim stood up and told me she'd be back shortly, that a nurse would be in to give me stronger pain medication and get me settled in a room. Before she left, she turned back and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "You didn't deserve this. Whatever he told you, whatever his mother told you, whatever you've been telling yourself, you didn't deserve this. No one does." After Dr. Kim left, a nurse named Kevin Walsh came in to administer pain medication through and for and help me get more comfortable. He was a tall, friendly man in his mid-30s with kind eyes and an easygoing manner that immediately put me at ease. As he worked, he chatted casually, mentioning that he'd actually seen me here before, during my visit in June for the laceration. He remembered because I'd seemed so nervous, kept apologizing for taking up their time, acted like I was an inconvenience rather than a patient who needed care. He said it had struck him as odd then, the way I'd been so grateful for basic medical attention, the way my husband had answered questions directed at me. He'd made a note in my file, nothing official, just a personal observation that something felt off about the dynamic he was witnessing. Kevin told me this while adjusting my his voice matter of fact but his meaning clear. The medical staff had been noticing. They'd been documenting. They'd been waiting for the moment when I was ready to admit what was happening. He said Dr. Kim was one of the best advocates for domestic violence survivors he'd ever worked with, that she'd helped dozens of women escape dangerous situations, that I was in good hands. Then he said something that surprised me. My sister went through something similar. It took her 3 years to leave, and by the time she did, he'd broken her collarbone, given her 2 concussions, and left scars she'll carry forever. The day she finally walked away was the day she got her life back. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you just took the first step toward freedom. The medication began to take effect, dulling the sharp edges of pain and making everything feel slightly distant and dreamlike. Kevin finished his preparations and told me they'd be moving me to a room upstairs shortly, that I should rest if I could. As he turned to leave, I asked him what I should do about Brandon and Diane, who were still in the waiting room expecting to take me home. Kevin's expression hardened slightly. Dr. Kim is handling that. She's informing them right now that you're being admitted, that visitors are restricted to immediate family at the patient's discretion, and that you've requested no visitors tonight. They won't be happy, but hospital security will enforce it if they make a scene. The thought of Brandon and Diane being told they couldn't see me, couldn't control the narrative, couldn't continue coaching me on what to say, filled me with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. I was moved to a private room on the 4th floor around 11 that night. The room was quiet and dim, with a window that looked out over the parking lot and the lights of Riverside stretching beyond. A different nurse came in to check my vitals and make sure I was comfortable, bringing me water and extra pillows to prop up my arm. She told me the orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Raymond Pierce, would be by in the morning to discuss the surgical plan. For the first time in hours, I was alone with my thoughts, and they were overwhelming. I kept replaying the moment my arm broke, the sound and the pain and the look on Brandon's face afterward. I kept hearing Diane's whispered words in the emergency room. I kept thinking about 5 years of marriage, of gradually shrinking myself to try to fit into the space they defined for me, of believing that if I could just be better somehow, if I could just meet their expectations, the violence would stop. But I also thought about Dr. Kim's words. You didn't deserve this. I tried them on, testing whether I could believe them. Part of me still wanted to make excuses, to say that I'd provoked him, that I should have stayed quiet, that this was somehow my fault. But another part of me, a part that had been buried under years of gaslighting and abuse, whispered that maybe Dr. Kim was right. Maybe I hadn't deserved any of it. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was a bad wife. Maybe the problem was that I'd married a violent man enabled by a mother who valued family reputation over basic human decency. I didn't sleep much that night. Pain woke me whenever the medication wore off, and fear kept me alert during the periods when I should have been resting. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I tensed, afraid it might be Brandon somehow getting past security. But morning came without incident, and with it came Dr. Raymond Pierce, the orthopedic surgeon. He was a calm, methodical man in his mid-50s who reviewed my x-rays and explained the surgical procedure in detail. He would need to insert a plate and several screws to properly align the bones and give them the support needed to heal correctly. The surgery would take about 2 hours, and I'd need to wear a cast for at least 8 weeks afterward, possibly longer depending on how well I healed. He asked if I had questions, and I asked the one thing I needed to know. Will I be able to use my arm normally again? Dr. Pierce considered this carefully before answering. With proper healing and physical therapy, you should regain most if not all function. However, I need to be honest with you. The way this fracture occurred, with that twisting force, there was significant soft tissue damage in addition to the broken bones. You may experience some ongoing stiffness or occasional pain, especially in cold weather or with heavy use. But you should be able to work, drive, perform normal daily activities. I nodded, absorbing this information. 8 weeks in a cast. Months of physical therapy. Permanent reminders every time my arm ached. The price I'd paid for finally standing up to Brandon was steep, but somehow it still felt worth it. The surgery was scheduled for early afternoon. Before they took me down to the operating room, Dr. Kim stopped by one more time. She brought with her a packet of information from the Riverside Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit and contact information for local shelters and legal aid services. She sat on the edge of my bed and spoke quietly, aware that I was groggy from the pre-surgery medications but wanting to make sure I heard this while I was still clear-headed. "Natalie, once you're discharged from the hospital, you're going to need to make some decisions. I strongly recommend you do not go back to your house if your husband has access to it. The most dangerous time for domestic violence victims is when they leave or when they report the abuse. Your husband now knows that medical professionals are aware of what's happening. That may escalate his behavior rather than curtail it." She went through the packet with me, showing me the section on restraining orders, the hotline numbers I could call 24 hours a day, the names of attorneys who specialized in domestic violence cases and often worked pro bono for women with limited resources. She told me that she'd filed a mandatory report with the police as required by law, and that a detective from the domestic violence unit would likely want to speak with me in the next few days. She emphasized that I didn't have to press charges if I didn't want to, that the decision was mine, but that having a police report on file could be crucial if I decided to pursue a restraining order or if Brandon escalated his behavior. I thanked her, my voice thick with emotion and medication, and she squeezed my uninjured hand gently before leaving. The surgery went smoothly according to Dr. Pierce, who spoke with me briefly in the recovery room before I was taken back to my private room. He said the bones had been properly aligned and the hardware was in place, that everything looked good, that I just needed to focus on healing now. I spent another night in the hospital, drifting in and out of sleep, my arm throbbing despite the pain medication. During one of my wakeful periods in the early morning hours, I used my phone to do something I'd been avoiding. I called my brother Caleb. Caleb was 2 years younger than me, a software engineer who worked for a tech startup in Eugene. We'd always been close growing up, but in the years since my marriage, I'd let that relationship drift. Brandon had made subtle comments about how much time I spent talking to my family, about how married couples should prioritize each other over their families of origin, about how my brother probably didn't understand our lifestyle since he was still single. Gradually, I'd called Caleb less, made excuses not to visit, kept our conversations brief and surface level. Now, hearing his voice answer groggily after several rings, I realized how much I'd missed him, how much I needed someone on my side who'd known me before Brandon, who remembered who I used to be. I told him everything. The words poured out in a rush, 5 years of abuse compressed into a 20-minute phone call. I told him about the first incident with my wrist, about the fall down the stairs that wasn't a fall, about every injury and every excuse and every time Diane had made me feel like I was the problem. I told him about the argument that led to my broken arm, about Diane's whispered comment in the emergency room, about Dr. Kim's intervention and the realization that I couldn't go back. Caleb listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard him take a shaky breath and his voice came back tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm coming to get you. As soon as they discharge you from the hospital, I'm driving up there and I'm bringing you back to Eugene with me. You're staying with me until we figure this out, and I don't care if it takes weeks or months. You're not going back to that house and you're sure as hell not going anywhere near him or his psychotic mother." I felt tears start again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than pain or fear. I told him the doctors thought I'd be discharged the next day, that I'd text him when I knew the exact time. He said he'd already be on the road, that he'd wait in the hospital parking lot if he had to, that there was no way he was letting me face this alone. We talked for a few more minutes, and before we hung up, he said something that made me realize how much damage the isolation had done. "I should have noticed sooner. I should have pushed harder when you kept canceling plans or making excuses not to visit. I knew something felt off, but I told myself you were just busy with married life. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I wasn't there." I told him it wasn't his fault, that I'd gotten very good at hiding the truth, that Brandon and Diane had been experts at maintaining the perfect family image. But secretly, I was grateful that Caleb was claiming some responsibility, not because he actually bore any blame, but because it meant he was invested now, that he wasn't going to let this go, that I had someone in my corner who would fight for me even when I was too tired or scared to fight for myself. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive hope I'd clung to in the early days of my marriage, the hope that things would get better if I just tried harder. This was different. This was the hope that comes from taking action, from telling the truth, from accepting help, from recognizing that staying was more dangerous than leaving. I was discharged from Riverside General on the afternoon of October 17, 48 hours after my arm had been broken. Dr. Pierce gave me detailed care instructions, prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 weeks out. A hospital social worker named Margaret Chen came by before I left with more resources, including the direct number for Detective Marcus Green from the Domestic Violence Unit. She said Detective Green was expecting to hear from me, that he'd been briefed by Dr. Kim, and that he was one of the good ones, someone who actually cared about building strong cases against abusers. She also gave me paperwork to start the process of obtaining a restraining order, explaining that I could file it at the courthouse and that it could be granted on a temporary basis very quickly if I demonstrated immediate danger. Caleb was waiting in the lobby when I was wheeled down in the mandatory wheelchair, hospital policy despite my insistence that I could walk. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually neat dark hair disheveled, his eyes tired but alert and focused on me with an intensity that made me want to cry all over again. He'd always been the protective younger brother, the one who'd confronted bullies on my behalf in school, who'd learned to cook when our mom was working double shifts so I wouldn't have to do it all myself. Seeing him now, seeing the fury and love in his expression, I understood that he was going to channel all of that protectiveness into helping me escape this situation. The drive to Eugene took just under 2 hours. Caleb had brought pillows to cushion my arm, had the air conditioning set to exactly the temperature I preferred, had downloaded a playlist of music he knew I liked. He didn't push me to talk, just let me sit in silence or chat about neutral topics whenever I felt ready. About halfway through the drive, I asked him if he thought I was doing the right thing, if maybe I should try talking to Brandon first, try to work things out, try counseling or separation before jumping straight to leaving. Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel and he was quiet for a moment before responding. His voice when he spoke was calm but absolutely certain. He broke your arm in 3 places. His mother told you he taught you a lesson. There's no marriage to save here, Nat. There's just a dangerous man and the woman who's finally smart enough and brave enough to get away from him. I know you loved him. I know you probably still love parts of him. But love isn't supposed to send you to the emergency room 4 times in 3 years. Love isn't supposed to leave you scared in your own home. The person you fell in love with, whoever you thought Brandon was, that person either never existed or he's been completely consumed by the abuser he's become. Either way, he's gone. The only person left is the man who hurt you, and you owe him nothing. The clarity of Caleb's words cut through the fog of doubt and fear that had been clouding my thinking. He was right. I'd been trying to save a marriage to a man who no longer existed, if he ever had. The charming, attentive man who'd courted me at church had been a facade, a carefully constructed image designed to trap me. The real Brandon was the man who grabbed and twisted and broke, the man who blamed me for his violence, the man whose mother celebrated his abuse as a teaching moment. That man didn't deserve my loyalty or my love or my willingness to keep trying. Caleb's apartment in Eugene was a modest 2-bedroom place in a quiet complex near the university. He'd already prepared the spare room for me, putting fresh sheets on the bed, clearing space in the closet, setting up a small desk with his laptop in case I needed to handle any paperwork or make phone calls. He'd even bought the specific brand of tea I liked and stocked the bathroom with toiletries. The thoughtfulness of these small gestures broke through my composure completely, and I stood in the middle of the spare room and sobbed while Caleb held me carefully, mindful of my broken arm, letting me cry without trying to fix it or make it stop. That evening, after I'd rested and eaten something, Caleb and I sat down to make a plan. He pulled out a legal pad and started making lists, his engineer's brain organizing the chaos into manageable steps. First priority was safety, making sure Brandon didn't know where I was, making sure I had a restraining order in place before he could track me down. Second priority was legal strategy, finding an attorney who could help me navigate both the restraining order process and the eventual divorce. Third priority was practical matters, getting my belongings from the house, handling joint accounts, notifying my employer about what was happening. Fourth priority was long-term stability, figuring out where I was going to live permanently, whether I'd stay in Eugene or return to Riverside, what my career path looked like going forward. The list was overwhelming, but having it written down made it feel less impossible. Caleb told me he'd already researched attorneys in the Riverside area, since that's where the case would need to be filed, and he'd found several who specialized in domestic violence cases and had good reputations. He'd also looked into the process for restraining orders and learned that I could file in either Riverside or Eugene, but Riverside made more sense since that's where Brandon lived and worked. He offered to take time off work to drive me back to Riverside to handle the legal filings, and I accepted gratefully, knowing I wasn't strong enough yet to face this alone. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in Caleb's spare room, I let myself think about what came next. The fear was still there, a constant hum of anxiety about what Brandon would do when he realized I wasn't coming back, about how Diane would react, about whether the Harper family would use their connections and reputation to make my life difficult. But underneath the fear was something else, something I'd almost forgotten existed. Anger. Clean, focused, righteous anger at what had been done to me, at the years I'd lost, at the person I'd become in trying to survive my marriage. That anger felt like fuel, like something I could use to power me through the difficult days ahead. I thought about Dr. Kim's words again, about how this fracture could have been so much worse, about how next time Brandon might break my neck. There wasn't going to be a next time. I was going to take every resource I'd been given, every piece of documentation, every ally who'd emerged, and I was going to build a case so strong that Brandon Harper would face real consequences for the first time in his privileged, protected life. And Diane Harper, who'd enabled and encouraged and celebrated his violence, she was going to face consequences too. I didn't know exactly what form that justice would take yet, but I knew I was going to fight for it with everything I had. The broken arm was just the beginning of their reckoning. I spent the first week at Caleb's apartment in a strange state of suspended animation, floating between relief at being away from Brandon and terror about what would happen when he found me. My phone rang constantly those first few days, Brandon's name lighting up the screen dozens of times. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemails he left, each one a study in manipulation and escalation. The first messages were worried and confused, his voice trembling as he asked where I was, whether I was okay, begging me to call him back. By the third day, the tone shifted to anger, accusations that I was being dramatic and childish, demands that I stop this nonsense and come home immediately. By the fifth day, the messages became threatening, thinly veiled warnings about what would happen if I didn't return, reminders about our joint accounts and shared assets, implications that I was making a huge mistake I'd regret. Diane left messages too, her voice dripping with false concern. She spoke in that carefully modulated tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, telling me that Brandon was beside himself with worry, that families worked through difficulties together, that running away solved nothing. In one particularly chilling message, she said that she understood I was upset about the accident but that these things happened in marriages, that her own husband had sometimes lost his temper, that the mark of a strong woman was knowing how to handle a strong man. She made it sound like Brandon's violence was my responsibility to manage, like his inability to control himself was somehow a reflection of my failure as a wife. Caleb sat with me while I listened to the messages, his jaw getting tighter with each one. After the last voicemail played, he took my phone and showed me how to save them all, how to back them up to cloud storage, how to document everything. He said these messages were evidence, proof of Brandon's mindset and Diane's complicity, things that could be useful if the situation escalated legally. Then he helped me compose a single text message to Brandon, brief and clear. I am safe. I need space. Do not contact me. I will reach out through legal channels when I'm ready. We sent it and then Caleb showed me how to block both Brandon's and Diane's numbers, cutting off their access to me and forcing them to sit with the uncertainty of not knowing where I was or what I was planning. On October 23, 8 days after my arm was broken, Caleb drove me back to Riverside to file for a restraining order. We'd made an appointment with the courthouse to ensure we'd have assistance with the paperwork, and Caleb had taken the day off work to accompany me. The drive back to Riverside filled me with dread, the familiar streets and landmarks making my stomach churn. I kept imagining we'd run into Brandon somehow, that he'd see us and cause a scene, that everything would spiral out of control. But Caleb reminded me that Brandon would be at work during business hours, that the courthouse had security, that we had a plan and we were going to stick to it. The Marion County Courthouse was an imposing gray stone building downtown, with high ceilings and marble floors that made every sound echo. We found the family court office on the second floor, and a clerk named Patricia helped us with the restraining order paperwork. She was a grandmother in her 60s with kind eyes who'd clearly helped hundreds of women through this process before. She walked me through each section of the form, explaining what the judge would need to see, how to document the abuse clearly and specifically, what timeline I should include. I wrote about the broken arm in detail, about the emergency room visit, about Diane's comment. Then Patricia asked if there had been other incidents, and I found myself documenting 4 years of violence that I'd tried so hard to minimize and forget. Writing it all down in black and white, seeing the pattern laid out chronologically, was devastating and clarifying in equal measure. The sprained wrist in November 2019. The bruised ribs in March 2021 that I'd attributed to falling downstairs. The laceration in June 2023 that required 12 stitches after Brandon had shoved me into a glass table during an argument about my decision to attend my brother's birthday party without him. Each incident by itself could be explained away, dismissed as an accident or an overreaction. But together, they formed an undeniable narrative of escalating domestic violence. Patricia read through my completed forms and nodded approvingly. She said judges took these petitions seriously, especially when there was medical documentation to support the claims. She explained that I'd go before a judge that afternoon for an ex parte hearing, meaning Brandon wouldn't be present, and if the judge found sufficient evidence of immediate danger, I'd be granted a temporary restraining order that would be effective immediately. Then there would be a full hearing scheduled within 2 weeks where Brandon would have the opportunity to contest the order, and a judge would decide whether to make it permanent. Patricia warned me that the full hearing could be difficult, that Brandon would likely hire an attorney, that his lawyer would try to discredit my claims and paint me as vindictive or unstable. But she also assured me that the evidence was on my side, that the medical records and police reports would speak for themselves. The ex parte hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Caleb and I sat in a waiting area outside the courtroom, surrounded by other people dealing with their own family law crises. I watched a young woman with a black eye rock a sleeping baby, an older man with his head in his hands, a teenager who couldn't have been more than 16 filling out paperwork with shaking hands. The family court system was full of pain and broken relationships, and I felt a strange kinship with these strangers who were all fighting their own battles for safety and dignity. When my name was called, I entered the courtroom with Caleb beside me. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Judge Andrea Foster, with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She reviewed my petition carefully, reading every page while I stood at the petitioner's table trying to control my breathing. Then she asked me to approach and tell her in my own words what had happened. I walked through the events of October 15th, describing the argument, the slap, the way Brandon had grabbed and twisted my arm until it snapped. Judge Foster listened intently, occasionally making notes, her expression growing increasingly stern. When I finished, Judge Foster asked if I had medical documentation of the injury. I provided copies of my emergency room records, the x-rays showing the 3 fracture points, Dr. Kim's notes that specifically mentioned the fracture pattern being consistent with a twisting injury rather than a fall, the surgical report from Dr. Pierce detailing the procedure to repair the damage. Judge Foster reviewed each document thoroughly, then looked up at me with something that might have been sympathy or might have been anger on my behalf. "Ms. Harper, based on the evidence before me, I'm granting you a temporary restraining order effective immediately. Your husband is to have no contact with you, direct or indirect, and he is to stay at least 500 feet away from you at all times. This order will remain in effect until the full hearing, which I'm scheduling for November 7th at 10 in the morning. At that hearing, both you and your husband will have the opportunity to present evidence and testimony, and I'll determine whether to make this order permanent." The relief I felt was overwhelming, physical, like a weight lifting off my chest. I had legal protection now, official documentation that what Brandon had done was wrong, that I had the right to be safe, that the court system was taking my side. Judge Foster explained that the sheriff's office would serve Brandon with the restraining order, likely at his workplace, and that once he was served, the order would be enforceable. If he violated it by trying to contact me or come near me, he could be arrested. She warned me to take the order seriously, to call the police immediately if Brandon made any attempt to violate it, and to document any and all contact attempts even if they seemed minor. Then she wished me luck and called the next case. Caleb hugged me carefully in the courthouse hallway after we left the courtroom, mindful of my broken arm, and I felt tears of relief streaming down my face. We'd done it. I had protection. I had taken the first real step toward reclaiming my life. On the drive back to Eugene, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I could finally breathe fully for the first time since I'd married Brandon Harper. Caleb stopped at a restaurant on the way and insisted we celebrate, and over pasta and wine, which I drank carefully given my pain medications, we talked about next steps. The restraining order was just the beginning. Now I needed to think about divorce, about dividing assets, about whether to cooperate with the police investigation that Dr. Kim had triggered with her mandatory report. That evening, back at Caleb's apartment, I finally called Detective Marcus Green from the Riverside Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and professional. He said he'd been expecting my call, that he'd reviewed the report from Dr. Kim and was prepared to move forward with an investigation if I was willing to cooperate. I asked what that would entail, and Detective Green explained the process clearly and without pressure. He would need to interview me in detail about the incident on October 15th and any prior incidents of abuse. He would review my medical records with my permission. He would attempt to interview witnesses, which might include medical personnel who treated me, neighbors who might have heard or seen concerning behavior, anyone who could corroborate my account. Then he would interview Brandon, likely with Brandon's attorney present, and give him the opportunity to provide his version of events. Detective Green was honest about the challenges of prosecuting domestic violence cases. He said that many times these cases came down to credibility, one person's word against another's, and that defense attorneys were skilled at creating reasonable doubt. But he also said that my case was stronger than most because of the medical documentation, because of the clear pattern of escalating violence, because of the witness statement from Dr. Kim about the fracture pattern. He believed there was enough evidence to pursue charges, likely assault in the second degree given the severity of the injury, possibly additional charges related to the pattern of abuse. If convicted, Brandon could face several years in prison, though first offenders sometimes received lighter sentences involving probation and mandatory counseling. I told Detective Green I wanted to cooperate fully, that I wanted Brandon held accountable not just through the civil restraining order but through criminal charges. He scheduled an interview for the following week at the Riverside Police Station, and said he'd coordinate with Caleb so my brother could be present for support. After we hung up, I sat with the weight of that decision. Pursuing criminal charges meant I couldn't go back, couldn't change my mind, couldn't be persuaded by Brandon's apologies or Diane's manipulations to drop the case and reconcile. It meant making a public accusation against a well-connected family, knowing they would use every resource at their disposal to defend Brandon and attack my credibility. But it also meant standing up not just for myself but for every woman who'd been told that keeping a marriage together was more important than keeping herself safe. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. I contacted a divorce attorney that Patricia at the courthouse had recommended, a woman named Lisa Brennan who specialized in high-conflict divorces involving domestic violence. Lisa had a reputation for being tough and thorough, someone who didn't back down from intimidation tactics or wealthy opponents with expensive legal teams. Our initial consultation was over the phone, and Lisa spent 90 minutes asking me detailed questions about my marriage, the abuse, the assets Brandon and I owned jointly, and what I hoped to achieve through the divorce. She explained that Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, meaning I didn't need to prove Brandon's abuse to get divorced, but that the restraining order and criminal charges would likely impact how assets were divided and whether I could claim compensation for the injuries I'd sustained. Lisa's strategy was aggressive and clear. She would file for divorce immediately, before Brandon had a chance to hide assets or create financial complications. She would request that I be awarded the house in Maplewood Estates despite Brandon having contributed more to the down payment, arguing that I needed stable housing and that Brandon's violence had made it impossible for me to remain in the marital home. She would document every penny spent on medical care related to the abuse and seek compensation for those costs plus pain and suffering. She would request spousal support given that my career had been disrupted by the abuse and my recovery. And she would ensure that Brandon had no claim on any settlement I might receive if the criminal case resulted in a restitution order. I authorized Lisa to proceed, signing the retainer agreement and providing her with access to all the documentation I'd been gathering. She said she'd file the divorce petition within 48 hours and that Brandon would be served simultaneously with the divorce papers and the restraining order, maximizing the impact and making it clear that I was serious about ending the marriage and holding him accountable. She warned me that Brandon's response would likely be swift and aggressive, that he'd hire his own attorney who would try to paint me as unstable or vindictive, that the Harper family would probably close ranks and use their social connections to influence public opinion. But she assured me that the evidence was on my side, that Oregon courts took domestic violence seriously, and that she'd fought and won cases against wealthier and more connected defendants than Brandon Harper. On October 28, 13 days after my arm was broken, Brandon was served with both the restraining order and the divorce petition at his office. I wasn't there to see his reaction, but Detective Green called me that afternoon to confirm that service had been completed and that Brandon had been informed of the terms of the restraining order. The detective said Brandon had been shocked and angry, had immediately called an attorney, and had made several statements that Green declined to repeat but characterized as not helping his case. I felt a savage satisfaction knowing that Brandon was finally facing consequences, that his carefully constructed image as a successful, respectable businessman was cracking, that people in his professional life now knew he was the kind of man who broke his wife's arm. The following days brought the backlash I'd been anticipating. Brandon's attorney, a man named Richard Kowalski who apparently specialized in defending wealthy clients accused of white-collar crimes and domestic disputes, sent Lisa a letter demanding that I retract the restraining order petition and drop the divorce filing. The letter claimed that I had manufactured allegations to gain advantage in property division, that I had a history of clumsiness that explained the injuries, that Brandon was a respected member of the community who would be irreparably harmed by false accusations. Lisa responded with a letter twice as long detailing the medical evidence, the police report, the pattern of documented injuries, and a promise that if Kowalski continued to pursue a strategy of victim blaming and evidence denial, she would ensure that every piece of documentation became part of the public record through court filings. I also started receiving messages through indirect channels, since Brandon and Diane could no longer contact me directly. Brandon's sister Catherine, the corporate attorney, sent me an email asking if we could talk, saying that she was sure this was all a misunderstanding, that families should resolve issues privately. I didn't respond. Diane left a message with Caleb's apartment complex manager, claiming to be my mother and saying there was a family emergency. When Caleb called the manager to explain that Diane Harper was not my mother and was in fact subject to a restraining order that prohibited indirect contact, the manager apologized and assured us it wouldn't happen again. Several members of Grace Community Fellowship reached out through social media, some expressing concern, others more clearly fishing for information they could relay back to the Harper family. The social isolation was harder than I'd anticipated. I'd lost most of my friendships during my marriage as Brandon gradually convinced me that my friends were bad influences, that they didn't understand our relationship, that spending time with them took away from our marriage. The few connections I'd maintained were primarily through church, and those people were now clearly on Team Harper, viewing me with suspicion or pity but not support. I found myself grateful for Caleb's presence, for his steady support and his refusal to let me doubt myself. He reminded me daily that I'd done nothing wrong, that leaving an abuser was an act of courage not betrayal, that anyone who couldn't see that wasn't worth my time or energy. On November 2nd, I drove back to Riverside with Caleb for my formal interview with Detective Green. The police station was a modern building with security checkpoints and a sterile, official atmosphere that made everything feel very real and very serious. Detective Green met us in the lobby and escorted us to a private interview room, offering coffee and making sure I was comfortable before beginning. He explained that he would be recording the interview, that I should take my time answering questions, and that I could take breaks whenever I needed them. Then he walked me through the events of October 15th in excruciating detail. He asked questions I hadn't anticipated, forcing me to reconstruct not just what happened but the context surrounding it. What had I been doing in the hours before the argument? What was Brandon's demeanor when he arrived home? What specific words were exchanged? Where exactly in the kitchen had we been standing? Which hand did Brandon use to grab my arm? How much force did he apply? What was the sequence of events from the moment he grabbed me to the moment my arm broke? What did he say immediately afterward? What did I say? When did Diane arrive and what were her exact words? Every detail mattered, every inconsistency had to be explained, every gap in my memory noted. The interview took over 3 hours. By the end, I was exhausted and emotionally drained, having relived the trauma multiple times while Detective Green probed for clarity and specificity. But I also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I'd told the truth, completely and without minimization. I'd provided Detective Green with everything he needed to build a case. And I'd done it without breaking down or backing away from the difficult details. When we finished, Detective Green thanked me for my cooperation and said he'd be following up with interviews of the medical personnel who'd treated me. He said he'd also be interviewing Brandon within the next week, and that once he had all the statements, he'd present the case to the district attorney's office for a charging decision. As Caleb and I left the police station, I felt both relieved and apprehensive. The machinery of justice was in motion now, moving forward whether I felt ready or not. In 5 days, I'd face Brandon in court for the restraining order hearing. In the weeks after that, the criminal case would proceed or not depending on the district attorney's decision. And somewhere in all of this, I'd need to rebuild my life, figure out who I was outside of being Brandon Harper's wife, create a future that didn't revolve around surviving abuse. That evening, back at Caleb's apartment, I received an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, wary of unknown callers, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was female, older, tentative. She introduced herself as Patricia Dobson, and said she'd been my neighbor at Maplewood Estates for the past 3 years. She'd gotten my number from the police, who'd contacted her as part of their investigation. She was calling because she needed me to know something important, something she'd witnessed but never reported because she hadn't been sure it was her place to intervene. Mrs. Dobson told me that on at least 6 occasions over the past 2 years, she'd heard arguments coming from my house late at night. She lived 2 houses down, but in the summer with windows open, sound carried clearly through the neighborhood. She'd heard shouting, heard things breaking, heard me crying. Once, she'd seen me come outside at nearly midnight, standing in the driveway in my nightgown, and she'd almost gone over to check on me but had hesitated, unsure whether I'd welcome the intrusion. Another time, she'd seen Diane arrive at my house in the middle of an argument, had watched through her window as Diane went inside and the shouting stopped. Mrs. Dobson said she'd felt guilty for not doing more, for not calling the police or reaching out to me directly. She'd told herself it wasn't her business, that maybe she was misunderstanding what she was hearing, that interfering in a neighbor's marriage could make things worse. But now, knowing what she knew about my broken arm, knowing that there was a criminal investigation, Mrs. Dobson wanted to help. She'd already given a statement to Detective Green, documenting the dates and times of the incidents she'd witnessed, offering to testify if needed. She told me she was sorry she hadn't done more sooner, and I found myself crying as I thanked her. Her testimony would corroborate my account of a pattern of abuse, would counter any claim that October 15th was an isolated incident or a mutual altercation that got out of hand. She was a witness I hadn't known I had, someone who'd been documenting Brandon's violence even when I'd been trying to hide it. After we hung up, I told Caleb about the call, and he added Mrs. Dobson's name to the growing list of potential witnesses and supporters. The case was building itself, piece by piece, into something substantial and undeniable. I had medical evidence. I had police reports. I had witness testimony. I had the restraining order as official court acknowledgement of danger. I had my own detailed account and Brandon's threatening voicemails that showed his mindset. What had started as a desperate escape from a violent situation was transforming into a comprehensive legal case that could not only protect me but might actually result in justice. The night before the restraining order hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about seeing Brandon for the first time since I'd left, about facing him across a courtroom, about the possibility that the judge might not believe me, might think I was exaggerating, might decide that a broken arm wasn't enough to justify a permanent restraining order. But I also thought about Dr. Kim's words about how next time might be worse, about Mrs. Dobson's courage in coming forward, about Caleb sleeping in the next room ready to support me through whatever came next. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, the one who'd believed Brandon when he said he'd love and protect me, and the woman I was becoming, the one who was learning to protect herself. Somewhere in that transformation was the person I needed to be to face what was coming, and as dawn broke on November 7th, I decided I was ready to find out who that person was. The morning of November 7th arrived cold and gray, typical early winter weather for Oregon. Caleb and I left Eugene at 7 in the morning to ensure we'd arrive at the Marion County Courthouse with plenty of time before the 10 o'clock hearing. I dressed carefully in conservative business attire, a navy blue dress and cardigan that Lisa Brennan had advised would present well in court. My right arm was still in a cast, impossible to hide and serving as visible evidence of exactly why I needed protection. Lisa had told me that the cast was actually helpful from a strategic standpoint, a constant reminder to the judge of the violence that had necessitated this hearing. We met Lisa in the courthouse lobby at 9:30. She was a woman in her late 30s with dark red hair pulled back in a professional bun, sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and an air of controlled intensity that immediately made me feel safer. She reviewed the plan with us one more time. I would testify first, walking Judge Foster through the events of October 15 and the pattern of abuse that preceded it. Lisa would introduce the medical records, the police report, Dr. Kim's statement, and Mrs. Dobson's witness testimony. Then Brandon would have the opportunity to present his case, likely claiming the injury was accidental or that I was exaggerating the circumstances. Lisa warned me that Brandon's attorney would try to paint me as vindictive, possibly claiming I'd fabricated or exaggerated allegations to gain advantage in the divorce. She said to expect personal attacks on my character, implications that I was unstable or attention-seeking, attempts to make me seem unreliable. But Lisa also reminded me that the evidence was overwhelmingly on my side, that Judge Foster had already found sufficient cause to grant the temporary order, and that we just needed to demonstrate that the danger was ongoing and real. She told me to answer questions directly and honestly, not to get defensive or emotional if possible, and to remember that the judge was evaluating credibility and risk, not likability. Then she squeezed my shoulder and said something that steadied my nerves. "You're not asking for anything unreasonable. You're asking for the right to exist without fear of violence. No reasonable person can deny you that." We entered the courtroom at 9:45. Brandon was already there, sitting at the respondent's table with Richard Kowalski and another man I didn't recognize, possibly a paralegal or associate. Brandon looked like he'd aged years in the 3 weeks since I'd last seen him. His face was drawn and tight, his eyes shadowed with dark circles, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. When I walked in, his eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made my stomach clench. The look wasn't sad or apologetic. It was angry, possessive, the look of someone who viewed me as a belonging that had been taken from him without permission. I forced myself to look away, to focus on Lisa and the table where we'd be sitting, to remind myself that I had every right to be here, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. Diane Harper sat in the gallery behind Brandon, her expression stony and disapproving. She wore an expensive-looking suit in charcoal gray, pearls at her neck, every inch the respectable widow of a judge. She looked at me like I was something distasteful she'd found on the bottom of her shoe, and I felt the familiar surge of inadequacy and shame that she'd always been able to provoke in me. But then Caleb sat down beside me at our table, and his presence reminded me that Diane's opinion no longer mattered, that her approval or disapproval had no power over me anymore. Judge Foster entered at exactly 10 o'clock, and we all rose. She took her seat, reviewed the file in front of her briefly, and then looked up at both tables. "This is a hearing to determine whether the temporary restraining order granted on October 23 should be made permanent. Ms. Harper, you have the burden of proof to demonstrate by a preponderance of the evidence that you are in danger of further abuse and that a restraining order is necessary for your protection. Mr. Harper, you have the right to contest the allegations and present evidence on your own behalf. Let's proceed. Ms. Brennan, call your first witness." Lisa stood and called me to the stand. I walked to the witness box on shaking legs, was sworn in, and took my seat. Lisa began with foundational questions, establishing who I was, how long I'd been married to Brandon, basic facts about our relationship. Then she moved into the events of October 15, and I told the story I'd now told multiple times to doctors, police, attorneys. But this time, Brandon was sitting less than 20 feet away, hearing every word, and I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. I described the argument, the slap, the way he'd grabbed my arm and twisted until I heard it snap. Lisa asked me to show the court my cast, and I held up my right arm, the white plaster covered now in signatures from Caleb and a few of his friends who'd been trying to cheer me up. Lisa introduced the medical records as exhibits, and Judge Foster reviewed them carefully. Dr. Kim's report was particularly damning, with her explicit statement that the fracture pattern was inconsistent with a fall and consistent with a twisting injury inflicted by another person. The surgical report detailed the 3 distinct fracture points and the hardware that had been necessary to repair the damage. Lisa walked me through my previous injuries, and I testified about the sprained wrist, the bruised ribs, the laceration, each one accompanied by medical records that corroborated my account. Then Lisa asked about Diane, and I recounted her whispered comment in the emergency room. "My son taught you a lesson." Judge Foster's expression hardened as I repeated those words. Lisa called Dr. Kim as a witness next, and the emergency room physician testified via video conference, having arranged to join from the hospital during a break in her shift. Dr. Kim was professional and unequivocal in her testimony. She described examining me, reviewing my injury history, recognizing the signs of domestic violence that had become a pattern over multiple emergency room visits. She testified that in her professional medical opinion, the injury I'd sustained was not accidental, that the fracture pattern and the history of prior injuries indicated an ongoing pattern of physical abuse. She stated that she'd filed a mandatory report with police because she believed I was in immediate danger, and that her concerns had been serious enough that she'd restricted visitors and arranged for my admission overnight specifically to give me time away from my abuser. Kowalski cross-examined Dr. Kim, trying to suggest that she'd overstepped, that she'd made assumptions based on incomplete information, that fracture patterns could be misinterpreted. But Dr. Kim held firm, calmly citing her 19 years of experience, her training in recognizing domestic violence, and the specific anatomical evidence that supported her conclusions. Kowalski tried to suggest that I might have exaggerated my symptoms or coached Dr. Kim towards certain conclusions, and Dr. Kim responded icily that she was a physician, not an advocate who could be manipulated, and that her conclusions were based solely on objective medical evidence and her professional expertise. Lisa then called Detective Marcus Green, who testified about his investigation. He described interviewing me in detail, reviewing the medical records, interviewing Mrs. Dobson and other potential witnesses. He stated that based on the totality of evidence, he'd forwarded the case to the district attorney with a recommendation for criminal charges of assault in the second degree. Kowalski tried to undermine Green's testimony by pointing out that charges hadn't actually been filed yet, suggesting that perhaps the case wasn't as strong as the detective claimed. Green responded calmly that charging decisions took time, that the district attorney's office was still reviewing the evidence, but that his recommendation stood and he was confident charges would be forthcoming. Mrs. Patricia Dobson testified in person, and her presence added a dimension to the case that I hadn't fully appreciated until I saw Judge Foster's reaction. Mrs. Dobson was a retired teacher, a grandmother, exactly the kind of credible, sympathetic witness who couldn't be easily dismissed as biased or unreliable. She testified about the multiple occasions she'd heard arguments and sounds of violence coming from my house, about the night she'd seen me standing in the driveway clearly distressed, about her regret that she hadn't intervened sooner. She said she was testifying now because she didn't want to carry guilt if something worse happened to me, and because she believed I deserved to be safe in my own community. Kowalski tried to suggest she was mistaken about what she'd heard, that sounds carried strangely at night and could be misinterpreted. Mrs. Dobson looked at him with the stern expression of a teacher dealing with a difficult student and said that she'd taught for 35 years and raised 4 children, and she knew the difference between a television show and a woman crying for help. After Mrs. Dobson stepped down, Lisa rested our case. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, medical documentation and witness testimony combining to create an undeniable picture of sustained domestic violence. Judge Foster called a 15-minute recess, and Lisa told me the first half had gone as well as we could have hoped. She warned me that the second half would be harder, that Kowalski would try to undermine everything we'd established, that I needed to be prepared for Brandon to present a completely different version of events. When we reconvened, Kowalski called Brandon to the stand. Brandon was sworn in and took his seat, and I watched as he transformed into the charming, reasonable man I'd fallen in love with years ago. His voice was measured and calm, his posture open and non-threatening. He testified that he loved me, that our marriage had been happy until recently, that he'd been shocked and devastated when I'd disappeared after what he characterized as an unfortunate accident. According to Brandon's version of events, we'd been having a normal conversation in the kitchen when I'd become inexplicably agitated. He claimed I'd started yelling at him about his work stress, accusing him of not spending enough time with me. He said I'd grabbed a dish and thrown it at the wall, and when he tried to calm me down by taking my arm gently, I'd jerked away violently and lost my balance, falling against the counter and somehow breaking my arm in the process. It was a masterful performance, delivered with just the right combination of sadness and confusion. He portrayed himself as a concerned husband bewildered by his wife's sudden instability, as a victim of false accusations who just wanted to save his marriage. He testified that he had no idea why I was claiming he'd deliberately hurt me, that he'd never raised a hand to me in anger, that the previous injuries I'd sustained were all accidents that I'd told him about after the fact, usually claiming I'd been clumsy or hadn't been paying attention. He suggested, with apparent reluctance, that I might have mental health issues he'd been unaware of, that perhaps I needed help rather than a restraining order. Kowalski led Brandon through this testimony skillfully, never asking questions that would open doors Lisa could exploit on cross-examination. Then Lisa stood up for her turn, and I watched as she methodically dismantled Brandon's credibility. She started by asking about his voicemails to me after I'd left. Brandon claimed they were expressions of concern, but Lisa played several of them for the court, and the threatening tone was unmistakable. In one, Brandon said that I would regret embarrassing him this way, that I was making a mistake I couldn't come back from. In another, he said that I'd never be able to support myself, that I'd come crawling back, that I needed him whether I wanted to admit it or not. Judge Foster's expression grew increasingly skeptical as she listened. Lisa then asked Brandon about his mother's comment in the emergency room. Brandon claimed Diane had never said that I must have misunderstood or imagined it. Lisa asked if he was calling me a liar, and Brandon said carefully that he thought I was confused and upset, possibly medicated, and might have misinterpreted something his mother said. Lisa moved on to the medical evidence, asking Brandon to explain how a fall could produce the specific fracture pattern that 3 different medical professionals had characterized as inconsistent with falling. Brandon said he wasn't a doctor, that he couldn't explain the medical details, but that he knew what had happened and I'd fallen. Lisa asked him to demonstrate for the court how someone falling against a counter would end up with fractures indicating a twisting injury. Brandon grew flustered, unable to physically recreate a scenario that made sense. Then Lisa asked about the previous injuries, and Brandon's story began to unravel further. He claimed I'd told him about spraining my wrist by sleeping on it wrong, but Lisa produced the emergency room record from that visit showing I'd initially told the triage nurse I'd been grabbed before changing my story. He said the bruised ribs were from falling downstairs, but Lisa pointed out that the medical examination had found bruising in a pattern more consistent with being shoved or struck. He insisted the laceration had been from tripping near a glass table, but Lisa had the emergency room report noting that the cut's location and angle suggested impact from being pushed rather than falling. With each inconsistency, Brandon grew more defensive and less credible. Kowalski tried to rehabilitate Brandon on redirect, asking him to reaffirm his love for me and his desire to reconcile. Brandon obliged, looking directly at me as he spoke about how much he missed me, how he wanted to get counseling together, how he believed we could work through our problems if I'd just come home. The words might have worked on me once, might have triggered the guilt and the hope that maybe things could be different. But sitting in that courtroom with my arms still in a cast, with the evidence of years of violence documented in medical records and police reports, I felt nothing but revulsion. This man had broken my bones and tried to break my spirit, and now he was performing remorse for a judge, using love as a weapon one more time. Kowalski then called Diane to testify, and I braced myself. Diane took the stand with perfect composure, dressed immaculately, her voice cultured and calm. She testified that Brandon was a devoted husband, that I'd always seemed happy in their marriage, that she'd been shocked by these accusations. She denied making the comment I'd attributed to her in the emergency room, suggesting with a sad shake of her head that I must have been confused by pain medication. She painted herself as a concerned mother-in-law who'd only ever wanted the best for her son and his wife, who'd welcomed me into the family with open arms, who couldn't understand where these terrible allegations were coming from. Lisa's cross-examination of Diane was surgical and devastating. She asked Diane about her late husband, the respected judge, and whether he'd ever been violent with her. Diane stiffened and said that was irrelevant. Lisa pressed, and Diane finally admitted that her husband had been a man of strong convictions who sometimes expressed his feelings physically, but that she'd never considered it abuse, just the dynamic of their marriage. Lisa asked if Diane had ever received medical treatment for injuries inflicted by her husband, and Diane reluctantly acknowledged one emergency room visit for a broken finger, claiming it had been an accident during a disagreement. The parallel was clear and damning. Diane had normalized violence in her own marriage and was now enabling it in her son's. Lisa then asked Diane about the message she'd left with Caleb's apartment complex, the one where she'd claimed to be my mother to try to reach me despite the restraining order. Diane said she'd been desperate to help me, to make sure I was safe. Lisa pointed out that claiming to be someone's mother when you're not was deceptive, that leaving messages through third parties was an attempt to circumvent the restraining order's prohibition on indirect contact, that Diane's behavior showed a pattern of trying to control and manipulate me even when legally prohibited from contacting me directly. Diane grew defensive, insisting she'd only been trying to help, but her credibility was shattered. Kowalski called one more witness, Brandon's sister Catherine, who testified that Brandon had always been a gentle person, that she'd never seen any indication he was violent, that she believed this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But on cross-examination, Lisa established that Catherine lived in Portland, saw Brandon primarily at family gatherings where everyone was on their best behavior, and had no actual knowledge of what happened in our home behind closed doors. Catherine admitted she'd never visited us at home unannounced, had never spent significant time with us as a couple outside of formal family events, and was essentially testifying to Brandon's public persona rather than his private behavior. After Catherine stepped down, both sides rested. Judge Foster announced she would take a brief recess to review her notes and would return with her ruling. The 20-minute wait was excruciating. I sat between Lisa and Caleb, trying to read Judge Foster's expression in my memory, trying to guess which way she was leaning. Lisa seemed confident but cautioned me that judges were unpredictable, that we'd presented a strong case but that didn't guarantee the outcome I needed. Caleb held my hand and told me that regardless of what happened, we'd figure it out, we'd keep me safe. Judge Foster returned and the courtroom rose. She took her seat and looked directly at me, then at Brandon, her expression grave. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, the testimony of the witnesses, and the exhibits submitted by both parties. This is a serious matter involving credible allegations of domestic violence and a request for ongoing protection. The court takes these petitions very seriously because the stakes, the safety, and potentially the life of the petitioner, could not be higher. She paused, and in that pause, I felt my entire future hanging in balance. Judge Foster continued, her voice firm and clear. The court finds that Ms. Harper has met her burden of proof by a preponderance of the evidence. The medical documentation, particularly the expert testimony of Dr. Kim regarding the fracture pattern, is compelling and credible. The history of prior injuries documented in medical records establishes a pattern consistent with ongoing domestic violence rather than isolated accidents. The witness testimony of Detective Green and Mrs. Dobson corroborates Ms. Harper's account and contradicts Mr. Harper's version of events. The voicemails played in court demonstrate a controlling and threatening attitude that belies Mr. Harper's claims of being a concerned husband. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over it, but I forced myself to focus on every word. Most significantly, Judge Foster said, looking directly at Brandon now, the court finds that Mr. Harper's testimony lacked credibility. His explanation for how the injury occurred does not align with the medical evidence. His characterization of prior injuries as accidents is contradicted by medical records and his wife's contemporaneous statements to medical personnel. And his mother's testimony, which attempted to normalize violence in intimate relationships and minimize serious injuries, only reinforces the court's concerns about the environment Ms. Harper has been living in. Judge Foster picked up her gavel, and I held my breath. Therefore, the temporary restraining order is hereby made permanent. Mr. Harper is prohibited from having any contact with Ms. Harper, direct or indirect, and must maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from her at all times. This order will remain in effect for 5 years, at which point Ms. Harper may petition for renewal if she still feels it necessary. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. Furthermore, the court is forwarding a copy of today's proceedings to the district attorney's office to assist in their ongoing investigation of the assault allegations. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel striking was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I felt tears streaming down my face, but this time they were tears of relief and vindication. I'd been heard. I'd been believed. The court had recognized what Brandon and Diane had tried so hard to hide and deny, that I'd been living in fear and danger, that I had the right to protection, that their version of reality was a lie. Lisa hugged me carefully, mindful of my cast, and Caleb wrapped his arms around both of us. Across the courtroom, I could see Brandon sitting in stunned silence, Kowalski gathering papers with tight-lipped frustration, Diane dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief in a performance of grief that rang hollow after her testimony. As we left the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. The permanent restraining order meant Brandon couldn't contact me, couldn't come near me, couldn't use intimidation or manipulation to try to pull me back into his orbit. It meant I had legal protection backed by the threat of criminal consequences if he violated the order. It meant the court had officially recognized that I was a victim of domestic violence, which would strengthen my divorce case and support any future legal actions. Most importantly, it meant I'd stood up to my abuser in the most public way possible and won. Outside the courthouse, Lisa reviewed next steps with us. The divorce would proceed now that the restraining order was permanent, with a hearing scheduled for early January to address property division and spousal support. She expected Brandon to fight hard on financial issues, but the restraining order and the ongoing criminal investigation gave us significant leverage. She also warned me that Detective Green had indicated the district attorney would likely file criminal charges within the next few weeks, possibly assault in the second degree as he'd suggested, and that once charges were filed, there would be a trial unless Brandon accepted a plea deal. That trial would be difficult, Lisa cautioned, requiring me to testify again and face aggressive cross-examination. But she also said that the evidence was strong enough that conviction was likely, and that a criminal conviction would provide additional protection and potentially result in restitution payments for my medical expenses. As Caleb and I drove back to Eugene that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with exhaustion. I'd faced Brandon in court and survived. I'd told my truth and been believed. I'd taken another step toward reclaiming my life from the man who'd tried to control and hurt me. The road ahead was still long, with the divorce, the criminal case, and the ongoing challenge of rebuilding my life from scratch. But for the first time since my wedding day 5 years ago, I felt like the path forward was mine to choose, that I had agency and power, that I wasn't trapped anymore. The permanent restraining order was more than a legal document. It was a declaration of independence, a line drawn in permanent ink, a statement that I would never again accept violence as the price of love. The criminal charges came 3 weeks later, delivered through a phone call from Detective Green on a Tuesday morning. Brandon Harper had been formally charged with assault in the second degree and criminal harassment, charges that carried potential prison time if convicted. The district attorney had reviewed all the evidence and decided the case was strong enough to proceed to trial, though they were also authorized to negotiate a plea agreement if Brandon was interested in accepting responsibility. Green told me that Brandon's attorney had already indicated his client would plead not guilty, that Brandon was maintaining his story about my injury being accidental. The trial was scheduled for March, giving me 4 months to prepare myself for what would likely be the most difficult testimony of my life. The divorce moved forward simultaneously, with hearings and depositions consuming hours of my time through the winter. Brandon fought viciously over every asset, trying to minimize spousal support by claiming I was capable of working full-time despite my ongoing physical therapy for my arm. Lisa countered with medical documentation showing the injury had affected my ability to perform certain tasks, that my career had been disrupted by years of abuse and the subsequent legal proceedings, that I deserved compensation for what Brandon had put me through. By February, we'd reached a settlement that awarded me the house, a lump sum payment equivalent to 3 years of spousal support, and coverage of all my medical expenses related to the abuse. It wasn't everything Lisa had hoped for, but it was enough to give me a fresh start. Through all of this, I began slowly rebuilding my sense of self. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in domestic violence recovery, working through the trauma and the patterns of thinking that had kept me trapped for so long. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, tentatively reaching out and finding that many of them had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to help. I looked for work that would accommodate my physical limitations while my arm healed, eventually finding a position doing medical billing remotely for a healthcare network, work I could do from Caleb's apartment while I decided where I wanted to settle permanently. The criminal trial in March was brutal but brief. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, walking the jury through the history of abuse and the specific events of October 15. Brandon's attorney tried every tactic Lisa had warned me about, suggesting I was vindictive, mentally unstable, motivated by financial gain. But the medical evidence was irrefutable, and Dr. Kim's testimony was devastating in its clinical clarity. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both charges. Brandon was sentenced to 2 years in prison with an additional 3 years of probation, mandatory domestic violence counseling, and ordered to pay restitution covering all my medical expenses and therapy costs. Watching Brandon being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of closure. This chapter of my life was finally, truly over. He couldn't hurt me anymore. The legal system had held him accountable. And I was free to build whatever life I wanted without fear of his violence or Diane's manipulation. In the months that followed, I discovered a new purpose. The Riverside Women's Advocacy Center had helped me navigate the legal system, providing resources and support when I needed it most. I began volunteering there, using my own experience to help other women who were trying to leave abusive relationships. By September, the center had offered me a position as a client advocate, and I'd accepted, moving back to Riverside into a small apartment near downtown. The work was difficult and emotionally demanding, but it felt meaningful in a way nothing else in my life ever had. 1 year after my arm was broken, I stood in the parking lot of Giuseppe's Italian Bistro, the restaurant where Brandon had taken me on our first date. I hadn't been back since before the marriage ended, but today I was meeting someone here, and the symbolism felt important. Dr. Vanessa Kim had reached out asking if I'd be willing to speak to a group of emergency room physicians about recognizing and intervening in domestic violence cases. She wanted to use my case as an example of how proper documentation and advocacy could save lives. As I walked into the restaurant, I thought about the woman who'd sat here 7 years ago, charmed by a handsome man who seemed perfect, completely unaware of the pain that relationship would bring. I thought about the woman who'd stood in her kitchen with a broken arm, finally understanding that love should never require endurance of violence. And I thought about the woman I was now, scarred but stronger, helping others find the courage to leave situations that could kill them. Dr. Kim was waiting at a table near the window, and when she saw me, she smiled with genuine warmth. We ordered lunch and talked about the presentation she was planning, about the statistics on domestic violence, about how many victims go unrecognized because medical professionals don't ask the right questions or document their suspicions properly. She told me that my case had changed how her entire emergency department approached potential abuse situations, that they'd implemented new protocols and training because of what she'd learned from treating me. As I left the restaurant that afternoon, I pulled out my phone and found a text from Caleb asking how the meeting went. I smiled and typed back that it had gone well, that I was doing good work, that I was finally building the life I deserved. The November sun was weak but present, cutting through the clouds, and I stood for a moment feeling its warmth on my face. My arms still ache sometimes, a permanent reminder of what I'd survived. But that scar was also proof that I'd fought back, that I'd refused to accept violence as love, that I'd chosen myself when it mattered most. The broken arm had been the beginning of my destruction, but it had also been the beginning of my freedom, and I would carry both truths with me for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.